Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly incredibly relevant topic drawn straight from Dr. Susan Edwards' brilliant essay on transformations. We're going to look at the massive global shifts happening all around us, and then we'll trace those massive changes all the way down to the deeply personal level. Specifically, we're looking at how the politics of identity actively reshape our society.
And, this quote right here brilliantly illustrates where we need to start. When the legendary Bob Dylan sang "The Times They Are A-Changin'" way back in 1963, he wasn't just writing a catchy tune, right? He was acknowledging a universal truth. The 1950s and 60s were these periods of massive structural upheaval. But as filmmaker Ken Burns argues, history arms people for the present. So examining these past transformations actually helps us make sense of our own fading orders today, and hopefully it leaves us a bit more optimistic about the future.
So here is the roadmap for our explainer today. First, we'll cover the nature of transformation. Then, entering the identity politics. From there, we'll look at the weight of implicit bias, the culture of otherness, the history of division, and finally, achieving transformative change.
Okay, Section 1. The nature of transformation. Examining global shifts. So before we can really understand internal human changes, we kind of have to look at the immense external shifts happening in the world around us. And transformation is incredibly broad. Dr. Edwards' text highlights that we are constantly surrounded by shifting networks of life. Take wildlife conservation, for example. Biologists in Panama are constantly having to balance economic development with the protection of hundreds of indigenous species. Or look at the digital revolution. Get this, a Wisconsin company named 3 Square Market is literally embedding microchips into their employees for cashless payments. I mean, that is bringing big data right into the human body. Then you have massive corporate consolidation. Did you know the US went from 10 major airlines in 2000 down to just 4 today, and those 4 control 83% of the market? And finally, we see the staggering economic transformations brought on by natural disasters, which drastically impact massive sectors like India's agricultural labor force. The main takeaway here? Our external world is in a constant, dramatic state of flux.
Section 2. Entering the identity politics. The human element of change.
Okay, so we've seen how the environment and the economy transform. But how do we adapt internally? Well, it brings us to a really crucial question. We are essentially the sum of our biology, our environment, our culture, and our relationships. Now, ever since the French Revolution, the concept of nationalism has galvanized states to bond around common languages and cultures. But we really have to ask ourselves, do we use our identity to create stronger bonds, or do we use it to undermine the value of others? And where exactly does that leave the people who just don't fit into the dominant culture?
To see how this friction actually plays out in real life, we can look at the National Football League. Former quarterback Colin Kaepernick began taking a knee during the national anthem to protest global oppression and police brutality. On the flip side of that, detractors viewed this gesture as fundamentally disrespectful to the nation's flag and those who fought to defend it. Now, we aren't here to take a side on this at all, but rather to observe what this friction represents. It brilliantly illustrates what happens when identity politics enter the public square. It forces us to ask, in what ways is society transformed when we engage in dialogue about our differences? And really, how can we ever achieve change if we completely fail to listen to divergent worldviews?
Section 3. The weight of implicit bias. The invisible framework.
To really grasp how the politics of identity becomes so divisive, we have to look at the invisible frameworks running in the background. University of Wisconsin professor Patricia Devine gives us this absolutely critical definition of implicit bias. She explains it as repetitive, learned behavior. And honestly, the scary part is just how subtle it can be. An offhand comment about gender, a joke about race, a stereotype about sexuality, all of these things, however inadvertent they might seem, support and reinforce implicit bias. Over time, these small behaviors weave themselves deeply into the actual decision-making frameworks of a whole society.
And this brings us to a really fascinating comparison from the source text. Consider these two totally distinct experiences. On one hand, you have Nelson Mandela's long walk to freedom, fighting the brutal, overt prejudice and implicit biases of apartheid in South Africa, all just to gain basic dignity for a minority culture. On the other hand, you have J.D. Vance's memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which details how working-class white Americans feel powerless and totally left behind by decision-making elites in a changing economy. Now, obviously, these are vastly different historical and cultural circumstances, but both examples show people reacting to a society whose decision-making frameworks have left them feeling stagnated or unequal. They both feel the crushing weight of being on the outside of the dominant system.
Section 4. The culture of otherness. Perpetuating divides.
So this shared feeling of being on the outside leads directly to what the academic Edward Said calls otherness.
Professor Devine notes that implicit bias is the exact fuel that creates this narrative of otherness. When you have modes of thinking that consistently push certain groups to the margins, it doesn't just create a temporary inequity. No, it actively solidifies a culture of inequality, and by extension, it perpetuates a culture of supremacy for whichever group happens to be at the top.
And if you're wondering just how pervasive this is, well, the narrative of otherness impacts a staggering array of groups across the globe. We're talking about women, the LGBTQIA community, religious minorities like Muslims and Jews, atheists, ethnic groups like Kurds, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and the poor. The sheer scale of this list is wild, and it proves that otherness is a universal human issue. It is a systematic failure to integrate non-dominant identities into the core social contract.
Section 5. The History of Division, a Legacy of Otherness.
Now, you might be wondering, is this just a modern problem? The answer is a resounding no. Humans have a very long, very tragic legacy of otherness. Back in antiquity, the Greeks and Romans actively created stereotypes about Macedonians and Gauls to elevate themselves. Jump to the Middle Ages, and you have writers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan documenting the distinct differences of the Russia culture. Fast forward to the colonial era, and the British Raj justified their entire occupation by claiming they needed to civilize the Indian population. And, perhaps most devastatingly, European and American cultures chronically dehumanized Africans to justify the absolute horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Throughout literally all of recorded history, the politics of identity have been used as a tool for division.
Section 6. Achieving Transformative Change, Moving Beyond Division.
So, if we know that the politics of identity can be incredibly divisive, how do we actually fix it? Because acknowledging the problem is really only the first step. The real work is asking ourselves, how do we actively challenge ideas of otherness? How do we move past the deeply ingrained historical habits of division to genuinely embrace diversity and inclusivity? It's not easy. It requires a conscious, active effort to rewrite those repetitive, learned behaviors of implicit bias that we talked about earlier.
I want to leave you with this incredibly provocative question straight from the source material. How can we see the best of what all people bring to society, acknowledge and assess those strengths, and use them to transform humanity? Our world is going through massive macro transformations, from the digital revolution to giant environmental shifts, but without a doubt, the most vital transformation we can make is internal. It's choosing to see the dignity and value in every single identity. So think about that as you navigate your own social contracts this week. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.